Well, welcome back. It's Monday, and we are plowing through Revelation. What a great book, and what encouraging teaching, not so much because of me, but it's God's Word. I mean, it's there for us to live in light of His coming, to live holy lives, to live with some urgency and purpose, as well as with fervent evangelism as we see what's going to be awaiting those who are, to coin a phrase, left behind. We're in chapter 14 today. I've entitled this Looking Forward. We could also call these heavenly realities. I think what we're looking at in chapter 14 is some of the heavenly or supernatural realities around the events of the final judgments and the return of Christ, is what we see here. Three movements, I'd say, three sections in this chapter. We see the 144,000 again in verses 1 through 5. And then from verses 6 down to about 13, we see this everlasting gospel being broadcast here. And then 14 through 20, the harvest is what we see here. So let's look at those 144,000. These are the same 144,000 from chapter 7. They are the ones that were all Jews, set apart by God. Here he sees them, and John is looking, and he sees them on Mount Zion. So Mount Zion is an interesting phrase here. It's the center of the Messianic kingdom. Most of the time in the Bible, not all the time, but most of the time it's used in a literal sense, and I would take it as a literal sense here. I think what John is seeing is the 144,000 gathered at the center of the Messianic kingdom. And look in verse 2, he hears a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sounds of harpists playing on harps. So John is hearing this heavenly voice, very loud, loud thunder. I think this is the fulfillment of what's predicted in Zephaniah 3:17, where God is going to be singing over the saved. I think that's what we're witnessing here, or what John is witnessing, and he's letting us see. But look in verse 3. It says, and they were singing a new song before the throne. So I think this is the 144,000. They're singing as well. It's a song that's unique to them. It's unique to them as the first fruits, it says in verse 4. They are the first fruits of the Lamb, redeemed from mankind. In fact, there's 4 things that's identified about them here. They haven't defiled themselves with women. In other words, they're virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. This is they're following Christ. They're redeemed from mankind, and there's no lie in their mouth. They're blameless. I think at this point, they've been fully redeemed. They are saints that are in heaven and glorified at this point. And I think what John is seeing here is not only God singing over them, but they are worshiping God. They are singing to him. This is kind of a antiphonal singing that we're witnessing here in heaven at the, I believe, the end of the tribulation. And then it says in verse 6, this section starting about the everlasting gospel, he saw another angel. Well, angels are all over the place in the book of Revelation. It would be an interesting study. I've got it on my list to do things, to go and study just angels in the book of Revelation. They're mentioned 194 times in 76 different verses. So if you want to know about angels, I think the book of Revelation is a great place to check. And if you look at the message that this angel is flying overhead with, fear God in verse 7, give him glory, because the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, sea and the springs of water. This is not a salvation message. I think this is more of a warning that we hear here. Gospel in the sense of the revelation of God And I think what is happening here is there's this final warning that's being given. Notice that he's identified as the God who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water. A couple comments there. Some people, again, I think I've mentioned before, some would look at the first couple of chapters of Genesis as possibly mythology, not literal, but clearly these angels, those who are worshiping him, understand that he made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water, that he is creator God. They are taking Genesis 1 and 2 literally. I think we should too as well. Also want to point out that in this section here, that it's not, again, a message of salvation. If you look at, for example, Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following, it's clear that the general revelation of God in his creation, specifically here the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, is a witness to the existence of God, but it doesn't give us enough information for salvation, only for condemnation. I really think that's what's happening here. If you see a message of salvation here, leave me a comment or send me a note at Dr. Dan, D-R-D-A-N, at theofaith.com. I'd love to hear from theofaith.org. Love to hear from you, but that's my view of this section here. Verse 9, we transition into the section about the beast. Now, the beast was introduced in chapter 13, verse 1. This is the beast from the sea, which we identified as the Antichrist. And we have two sections here. Verses 9 to 11 is a condemnation, and then 12 to 13 is an exhortation or an encouragement. So let's look at the condemnation. There's a warning here from yet another angel saying in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also drink the cup of God's wrath. It's pretty serious here. In verse 10, they're going to have the cup of God's wrath. In verse 11, they're going to be suffering torment. In verse 11 again, they'll be suffering torment forever. Now, I've read on the internet and have seen people comment on, apparently at some point John MacArthur has said that people who received the mark of the beast during the tribulation can still be saved. I'm hoping I'm getting that right. I haven't looked that up directly, but it doesn't seem to me from these verses that that's possible. I think there's a stern warning here. If they take that mark, they're going to suffer God's wrath. They're going to suffer torment, and that torment's going to be eternal. So there's a condemnation there. And then starting in verse 12 is a encouragement for the saints. So that designation there is indicating that even at this late stage in the tribulation, there are people that are being saved. Since the church was raptured before chapter 6, we know that these are saints that have come to faith during the tribulation, and God is giving them endurance, encouragement for endurance, that assuring them that what they suffer will be vindicated, even if they suffer death. We see the harvest then beginning in verse 14 of this chapter. I think there's three harvests going on here. Verses 14 through 16 is a wheat harvest. 17 through 19 is a grape harvest. And then verse 20 is a warning about judgment. Some have looked at the wheat harvest as a harvest of Gentiles, at the grape harvest at a harvest of Jews. That's possible. It's not clear here to me, but I think it's possible. Notice that in verse 14, this is one like the Son of Man and has a golden crown on his head. So there's two types of crowns in the book of Revelation. There's a diadem, which is a royal crown. It's the kind of crown that, say, Queen Elizabeth would wear, or the King of Belgium. I think Belgium still has a king. He would wear a royal crown. It's a diadem. This is a different kind of crown. It's a Stephanos crown. It's the victor's crown. I think I mentioned before in way of illustration that if you look up the winner of the Boston Marathon, after they've recovered a little bit, they usually have kind of a golden olive wreath on their head. That's a victor's crown, a Stephanos. And that's what the Son of Man, Jesus' favorite designation of himself, is wearing here, a Stephanos crown. Notice at the end of verse 15 that the hour has come to reap. So God has a specific time. I think this is the final harvest that's happening here, because notice at the end of verse 15 says it's fully ripe. So this is a Greek word that means dried up, fully ready, or possibly even past ready, indicating God's continuous patience and kindness. Verse 17, then, we see the grape harvest, another angel. This angel is said specifically to have authority over fire, which I think is an allusion to chapter 8, verse 5, where the angel is bringing the first of the trumpet judgments on the earth and has a censer full of fire that he casts to the earth. Notice that he's gathering clusters from the vine, and they are ripe. It's a different Greek word here, though, than the previous one. Previous one said dried up and ready, or maybe even past ready. This one says in full bloom. This is the ideal time, the best time. So a little different usage here. Two different harvests. Again, some understand this to be a harvest of Gentiles and then the harvest of Jews. And then finally, this closes with judgment in this section. We're still in the section about the harvest. And we see in verse 19, the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So this seems to be a judgment of unbelievers at this point. Notice that the winepress is trodden and the blood flowed as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia, or about 180 miles. So, as I've told you before, you might remember or might not, I'm a recovering engineer. I did the math, figured out how many gallons of blood are in people and how many billions, really, of people would need to die in order to have this much blood. And it comes out to be about 145 billion people would have to die to produce this much blood. Well, currently in the world there's only 7.7 billion. So it seems to me that this is probably symbolic of the massive amount of death and destruction that's going to accompany what's going to happen in chapter 16, the bowl judgments, and then the return of Jesus in that final battle. So that's my view. Again, I'm praying that you are reading this and reading it with careful interest, reading it with fervent interest, taking note of what God is doing, that he is fully in charge here. He's completely sovereign over what's going on. And brothers and sisters, may we reach out to those who God has put into our lives. No accidents in God's economy. If you have friends and acquaintances that are unbelievers, they are in your life because God has put them there. And all you can do is offer the good news. You can't force them. You can't manipulate them, but you can offer it to them, and I pray that you do that. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 15, a short chapter for tomorrow. God bless you.